morning again, Green Spring. Before we get started on Who's Who, I might tell you that today is German Unity Day, and it commemorates the anniversary of German unification in 1990, 29 years ago. Well, today on Who's Who, I have Tom Hady, and if you've been walking through Hunter's Crossing in the last few weeks, and if you glanced to the left as you walked in, you saw a display of photographs on the art wall, beautiful black and white photographs, and those belong to Tom Hady. And Tom is with us today. We're going to learn a little bit more about Tom other than just his photographs. But you know, Tom, I've looked at your photographs several times, and I've read the articles there that you have displayed. And your display is spectacular as far as I'm concerned. Those were really spectacular photographs.
Thank you.
And I've heard others say the same thing. So, folks, if you haven't seen the display of art on the Hunter's Crossing art wall, please go over in the next few days, because it's going to be taken down, and another artist will have her art displayed for a couple of months. So please get over there in the next couple of days. Just get on the shuttle and go to Hunter's Crossing. Spend a half hour looking over the photographs, get back on the shuttle, and go home. Get over there.
Actually, we're a little late. We took the photos down yesterday.
Oh, no. I thought they were supposed to put the others were going up next week, not this one.
No. Well, I'm not sure when the new ones are going up, but we took the photos down yesterday. So I'm sorry to say that if you didn't get over to see them, you're too late.
Forget all I said in the last couple of minutes. All right, Tom. Well, tell us about your immediate family. What you have any children around here? Or?
We have two children. One of them lives now in Richmond, Virginia. She's retired from the general accounting office. Our son lives out in Portland, Oregon, and he's a rather senior research engineer with the Intel Corporation.
Oh.
And each of them had two children. Susan's the daughter in Richmond. One son is a teacher in the public schools teaches music in the public schools down in Powhatan County, and also nights, weekends, plays with the best dance band in the Richmond area. I know they're the best dance band in the Richmond area because their website says so.
Okay. Why does she play?
The other grandson is a PhD psychologist and works for a private firm here in the Washington area. The son out in Oregon also has two children. A grandson is in the PhD program in biomedical engineering at the University of Washington, and a daughter who's at Northeastern University up in Boston in a pre-med program.
Got some smart kids, huh?
And
grandkids.
Yeah, they've been a very successful bunch.
Yeah. Well, what about your folks and your siblings? Did you have any brothers and sisters?
I had no brothers and sisters. I was an only child. My mother and father both came from Minnesota. Mom from a farm up in the Red River Valley, which is the west central part of the state, and Dad from a small town actually a couple of small towns in east central Minnesota, up in the area which when he was growing up was still being logged.
Oh.
And so for the first 11 years of his life, roughly, he lived in a little mill town in that area, and then
I guess
my grandfather died in a lumber camp up there when Dad was 12, and they moved to a little larger town, Pine City, for the rest of that time.
I guess I don't think of Minnesota as being a logging state. You know?
It was back around the turn of the century, a little before and a little after. They were cutting the white pine up there, and if you've ever worked with a piece of white pine, it's a joy to.
Yeah.
I had the experience of having to take a little piece about this long, that thick, plane it flat, then plane a 90-degree side on it, and do a whole bunch of other things. This was a practice block in 8th grade wood shop. And it was, for an 8th grader who wasn't that handy really with his hands, that was an experience. But I came away with especially in later years when I was working with lumber that wasn't nearly as easy on you, a great respect for the white pine.
Now, I've worked with white pine. I've worked with several woods but the pines are pretty easy, period, but white pines especially. Okay, well, where did you go to school then?
Okay, I spent the first 7 years in the Milwaukee area, 4 years of that in Whitefish Bay, which is a northern suburb of Milwaukee, and then during World War II, we moved out to Pewaukee, an exurb, and had lived on a small farm right on the edge of town. Did some subsistence farming on the side. Dad kept his job in town. Mm-hmm. But that was where, for example, I learned how to drive on a tractor several years before I was old enough to get a driver's license. And it was a wonderful place for a late grade school age boy to grow up, because we made our own fun. We solved our own problems. But it was one of those cases where there was always an adult somewhere not too far away who knew your parents.
And you learned a lot of how to do things.
Yes. Oh, yes.
You know, and it was just I understand that.
Then, when I started the 8th grade, we moved to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul area. I went through high school in Anoka, Minnesota, which is a suburb 20 miles or so north. People won't have heard of Anoka, although they probably have heard of it, because Garrison Keillor was 6 or 7 years behind me in school. I never knew him. But I always say that Anoka must have been the model for Lake Wobegon. So I can legitimately claim to be one of those children who were all above average.
I see, all right. And a citizen of Lake Wobegon. Well, in college you went on to...
I went off to the University of Minnesota in 1951. Knowing that unless I discovered when I got to college that I couldn't cut the mustard, that I wanted to go on to graduate school in something, I wasn't sure what. I listed either physics or economics on my major, but I gradually decided that economics was a better fit.
Now, your dad was an economist, right?
My dad was an agricultural economist. Worked for a predecessor, actually, of the agency that I eventually worked a career for in the Department of Agriculture.
So that probably had something to do with your desire to be
certainly I knew I knew a lot more about what economics was about than I would have without having a father who was in that field. When I got to the point of making a choice, I asked my dad if he thought I'd make a good economist, and he flatly refused to tell me. He said, if you make the wrong choice, I don't want it on my conscience.
Oh.
But I went ahead, and I think it turned out that I made a good economist. So I majored then, stayed at the university until I got my PhD.
So you went straight instead
I went straight through.
so you weren't really worried about bachelor's and master's degrees. You were really looking to the PhD. Isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's true.
Why did you do? Why did you look at? What caused you to think of that path? Because most students don't think that.
Well, I had I knew that I enjoyed doing research. I love to look at an issue or a problem and analyze it and try to figure out on the basis of some kind of evidence what the best solution is. And economics is a very good kit of tools for doing that. In retirement, I don't read a lot of economics anymore. I read a lot more history, but I still think like an economist.
Oh, okay.
And I did my work in general economics rather than ag econ, although I spent some time over in the ag econ department also. They had some aspects of economics that I thought you could learn a lot from.
But I assume, though, that since you were interested in research, you saw that the real road to doing research was to get the PhD.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, okay.
I was probably, I thought, headed for a college professor job somewhere. Although later, as it turned out, when I came on the market, the best offer that I had was from the Economic Research Service.
Well, immediately after you left college, though, you went into the Air Force, or?
I'd been in Air Force ROTC.
Yeah.
So I was commissioned when I got my bachelor's degree. I got a delay in call to active duty. Initially, it was only to get through a master's. That was all they were offering. But by the time we got to there, the Korean War had wound down. Looking at it from the outside, the Air Force really didn't need more junior officers, I think. And so they were perfectly happy to delay it. So in 1960, with my dissertation basically completed, but had needed to be written, I went on active duty with the Air Force out in Colorado Springs at Headquarters Air Defense Command.
Oh.
Found out that the Air Force really didn't have any jobs that used the skills of an economist, and that was not one of the fun periods of my life. I was idealistic. I learned a lot. But I finished the degree nights and weekends while I was on active duty, and came off active duty in '62. And as I say, the best offer at that point was from the Economic Research Service and the Department of Agriculture.
Now, just what does the Economic Research Service do in the agriculture business?
That has evolved through the years. The old Bureau of Agricultural Economics, which was where my dad started out, did research, I would say, primarily in support of farmers, and that's back in the days when there were an awful lot of farmers. A large proportion of the U.S. population were engaged in farming.
Sure.
As
about 3/4, wasn't it?
Agriculture has evolved and become mechanized, the production is concentrated in the hands of a much smaller number of farmers. You can argue about how many of their farmers there are, depending on how you define them.
Yeah. Well,
but the ERS has become, and the BAE was becoming, an agency that supports policy. We got a problem what are the tools that might actually help to solve it in rural areas. And I spent my career actually primarily working on problems of other than purely farm problems of rural people, but not particularly how much wheat to plant.
So it was really both the agriculture part of it as well as the farmer himself.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, when I came, my specialty in my graduate training was public finance. And I came into a section that was farm taxation and rural government was the name of it. And I fairly quickly became modestly a national expert on a particular problem. Farmers on the rural-urban fringe were finding that they really had to sell the farm to a developer because property taxes were getting so big. The land was worth much more for houses than for corn.
Sure.
And communities were bothered by the fact that this was going on, that too much farming was going out too fast. And so they were trying to adjust property taxes. And the particular role that we in ERS were trying to play was to find out what various programs that were being used, how well they worked, analyze the effects of the programs. Some of them simply forgave the property taxes. They said, we'll assess the land at its value in agriculture regardless. Others will assess, we will charge you the taxes based on that, but for 3 or 5 years, we'll carry the difference on the books. And if you sell it outside of agriculture, then you owe us the difference. And
now these are local taxes, right?
These were local taxes. Yeah. But of course, in most states, the local government can't put one of those programs in if the legislature hasn't said they can. In those days, at least, most states were so-called Dillon rule states that local governments had only the powers that the state gave them. And we were a central point. I found myself going around the country talking to legislative committees about what was going on in other states and how it was working and so on.
So were you in this always in Washington, or did you?
I was always in Washington.
Okay.
Then Johnson administration came along. The war on poverty came along, and of course that had a huge rural dimension to it. And ERS pivoted to support those kinds of problems. And by that time, I was in charge of a branch that looked at community resources. We, for example, had one section that was analyzing the quality of housing in rural areas, trying to identify both the areas where the housing was bad and what kind of programs you could use to improve it.
Now, the housing, though, was that rural or rural?
Rural housing. The department had the Farmers Home Administration as an action agency that worked on that, and we worked with Farmers Home.
Okay, so you spent your career in really looking at the problems to supporting agricultural policy and the people involved in it.
Right.
But you said that the war on poverty by Johnson affected the farm people a lot. Just how did that?
Well, the idea of the war on poverty was to lift the people who were in poverty.
But most of that was inner city, wasn't it?
No,
No,
there was an awful lot of rural poverty.
Oh, okay.
And so there needed to be a rural dimension to the whole thing. Yeah, think in terms, for example, of Appalachia.
Yeah.
And that much of that was rural, and much of it was pretty poor.
Yeah. I just
then that.
I just finished reading the book Hillbilly Elegy.
Okay.
And referenced the Appalachians. Of course, I grew up in Appalachia too, down in the Southwest Virginia. But the poverty that you're talking about is real, and it's very, very real. Okay.
And we haven't solved that problem yet.
No.
Then priorities shifted again, and money for that kind of research became harder to get, and ERS shifted with the government priorities. I found myself really back doing the kind of economics, general economics, that I had started out doing, in charge of a branch that looked at the relationship between the national economy and the rural economy. And of course, by that time, international affairs had become much more important. And so we were concerned with some of those impacts on the national economy. I suppose one of the best ways to summarize that, at least one aspect of what we did, by that time I had a couple of very bright young economists who, as one of them said, lived in the data stream, and we produced the economic outlook, general economic outlook that the agricultural outlook people used to estimate the outlook for agricultural products, and that was a sort of regular product.
Yeah. Well, but, let's switch now.
When the stock market crashed in '87, was it? Next morning, we were getting phone calls from all over the department wanting to know what effect that would have on the rural economy, and that kind of summarizes that aspect. Then later on, they also moved the agricultural history work into my branch, and so I had responsibility for that. And since I minored in history and back in undergraduate days, I enjoyed that.
Well, let's switch now to photography.
Okay.
You got interested in photography in the very early, as a very young man.
Age 13, for my 13th birthday, I was given a develop and print your own pictures kit. I got a number of those kinds of things growing up. That one stuck. Dad told me years later, he figured, well, Tom will learn a little bit about handling chemicals, and I did. But that one stuck as a hobby. And by the time I probably was a freshman in high school, I acquired a reasonably good camera. Wow. I'd been using various folding cameras from the family up to that point. But I got a Kodak 35 millimeter film camera, entirely manual.
So you had to do every setting, huh?
You had to do every setting, and as a matter of fact, one of the earlier developments was a built-in rangefinder with a needle, and you'd adjust the shutter speed or lens aperture till you centered the needle. I didn't even have that. So I had to learn to look at a scene and estimate what the proper what the proper exposure would be. I was better at it at age 16 than I am today with all the automation.
Yeah.
That skill has deteriorated over the years. And I had a variety of places to do it in the dark through the years, but I never had a real dark room until many years later. Our first year of marriage, I did my processing by laying my trays out on the bottom of the tub in the bathroom of our apartment, which was inside plumbing literally. It had no windows, so it was easy to get dark. I still laugh at the time I was doing that. My wife was out, and I thought I heard her at the door. And I hollered out, "I'll be there in a minute, honey." Well, it wasn't her, as it turned out, but a voice came floating down the ventilating shaft that went up through all of the apartments. We were in the basement. "No hurry."
Okay, so we've only got about 2 minutes.
Okay.
And you now use,
you
graduated from
I progressed through a series of cameras as the technology improved. In the early 2000s, I switched to digital. First, I just got a simple point and shoot digital to begin to learn that. But I quickly got something a little more serious. And I now use a Canon single lens reflex.
But the real thing about your pictures is done on the computer, isn't it?
No.
No?
No. Well, all of the processing is now on the computer.
Yeah.
It used to be I'd go down in the dark room and produce a black and white negative. I never felt like I had the time to get my color printing skills up to where I wanted them in the dark room. Once we went digital, I also started doing color. No, the joy of it for me is to sit down and nowadays on the computer with a picture that I took and start to adjust it. And my objective is to communicate to the viewer a little bit of what I felt when I took the picture. Well, that nearly always you have to sharpen a digital image a bit. Just the characteristics of the medium. Normally I need to adjust the color a bit, and then there are some other adjustments that you make for artistic reasons to.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate you coming on this morning. I thought we were going to talk a little bit more about photography.
Yeah,
but
I did too.
Your discussion on the agriculture problems was very interesting, and I appreciate that too.